Hello everyone. In this presentation, which is part of the endocrine system, we will be discussing the importance of the hypothalamic control over the pituitary gland. So let's get started. As we can see from this image, the hypothalamus is this region that lies inferior and anterior to the thalamus. That's why it's called hypothalamus, under the thalamus. And it's also going to be superior to the pituitary gland, which is located right over here. And its function is so important because the function of the pituitary gland is going to be dependent on the hormones that are released by the hypothalamus. And this is why we can say that the hypothalamus will control homeostasis and hormone release. Therefore, the hypothalamus, together with the pituitary gland, they will regulate several endocrine functions, which will include, for example, growth and metabolism. And if you think about it, these are really vital, important functions. Even if we just stop to think about what metabolism is and how this will affect our body, if we define metabolism like a very simple definition, it will be the chemical reactions that occurs throughout the body that will change, for example, food into energy. And our bodies need this energy to do literally everything, from moving to thinking. Therefore, this relationship of the hypothalamus with the pituitary gland is essential for our survival, as you can imagine. In fact, if we think about the location of the pituitary gland, it is so important that it sits protected by bone inside of what we call the sella turcica. As we can see highlighted on this image in pink, the sella turcica is going to be this depression or a fossa that's located in the sphenoid bone, which is what's highlighted. And the pituitary gland sits inside of this bony depression, and it's going to be very well protected. As we can see from this other image, the pituitary gland will have two lobes, which we call the anterior pituitary lobe, or just anterior pituitary, and the posterior pituitary lobe, or just posterior pituitary. Now, because the pituitary gland was once called the hypophysis, then the anterior pituitary was once called the adenohypophysis, and the posterior pituitary was referred to as the narrow hypophysis. Adeno relates to glands, meaning that the adenohypophysis will influence several glands, and the narrow hypophysis means that the neurons from the hypothalamus will have a direct influence on the posterior pituitary, or the narrow hypophysis. And I just wanted to make sure that I talked about those terms, as you might still see them floating around. When you hear about them, you know exactly what they are referring to. As we have seen previously, the pituitary gland will secrete several hormones, and because of this, it is known as the most compact chemical factory in the body. And it is really impressive that this tiny little gland has so many different functions, and we will learn about them in this learning outcome and in the next learning outcome. In addition, in this image, we have the structure that's called the infundibulum. And this infundibulum basically is going to extend from the hypothalamus inferiorly to the posterior and superior surfaces of the pituitary gland, holding the pituitary gland in place inside of the sella turcica. As we can see from the image here in the middle, which is actually an image of the model that we have in the lab, the hypothalamus has three different neuronal nuclei. Two that will be related to the posterior pituitary gland, which are the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus. And then the hypothalamic neurons, which is also a group of neurons, will have an influence in the anterior pituitary. Now notice how the ones that are going to the posterior pituitary, which are again the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus, their ends will actually be located in the posterior pituitary. So this means that the hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus will go from the hypothalamus and travel through these axons and end in the posterior pituitary gland. There are two hormones that travel from these neurons located in the hypothalamus directly into the posterior pituitary gland, and these are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Now, the paraventricular nucleus will be the one that will release oxytocin, and the supraoptic nucleus will be the one that will release the antidiuretic hormone. And on the image in the lab, we'll just consider that the one that's more superior to be the supraoptic, like supra on top. So this would be the supraoptic nucleus. Therefore, the other one will be the paraventricular nucleus. So supraoptic releases antidiuretic hormone, and the paraventricular nucleus releases oxytocin. Once these hormones reach the posterior pituitary, they will travel throughout the body through these capillary plexus located already in the posterior pituitary, and from here it will go to where it needs to go, and we will talk more about this later on. But just keep in mind that we have two different nuclei that will release two different hormones directly into the posterior pituitary. With regards to the anterior pituitary, notice how the neurons are going to be located in this nuclei over here, which is called the hypothalamic neurons, but they will end prior to reaching the anterior pituitary. And how will they get to the anterior pituitary? They will get there through what we call this hypophyseal portal veins. So they will travel from this hypothalamic neurons, and then they will go into the hypophyseal portal veins that will bring the hormones into the anterior pituitary. And once they reach the anterior pituitary, they will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release other hormones in response to the hormones that are arriving from the hypothalamus. Therefore, again, just to summarize, we have the paraventricular nuclei that will secrete oxytocin directly from these axons into the posterior pituitary, and then the supraoptic nuclei will secrete antidiuretic hormone that will travel through these axons and end also in the posterior pituitary, and from here it will travel to the body through these veins that are exiting the posterior pituitary. With regards to the anterior pituitary, it gets a little bit more complicated because there are several other hormones that will be released, and these will have an influence on the hormones that are actually going to be secreted by the anterior pituitary. Remember that the posterior pituitary does not secrete a hormone. The hormone is coming from the hypothalamus into the posterior pituitary and leaving the posterior pituitary. In other words, the posterior pituitary does not produce its own hormone. In contrast, the anterior pituitary will. The hormones that are listed here are the hormones that are released by the hypothalamus and that will have an influence on the anterior pituitary. These are the growth hormone releasing hormone, the thyrotropin releasing hormone, the corticotropin releasing hormone, the gonadotropin releasing hormone, and the prolactin releasing hormone. There are a couple of things that I want you to notice from these hormones. Mainly, tropin means that it will have a stimulating effect, and if you notice, all of them except for the growth hormone releasing hormone does not have tropin on it. However, all of them will have a stimulating effect that will cause the anterior pituitary to produce their own hormone in response to these hormones that are coming from the hypothalamus. Another thing that I want you to notice is that all of them have the word releasing on them. So this means that these hormones will act on the anterior pituitary for them to release their own hormone. So it makes it a little bit easier for you to remember those names, because if it's coming from the hypothalamus into the anterior pituitary, they will have the word releasing on them. In addition, almost all of them will have the word tropin on them, except for the growth hormone releasing hormone. And remember that the neurons that are releasing the hormone in the hypothalamus are these neurosecretory cells, which can also be called hypothalamic neurons.